Good morning. I'm Bob Cusack, Editor-in-Chief of The Hill. We are live streaming this morning's event on thehill.com. I first want to thank the USC Schaefer Center for sponsoring this event, and also on Twitter. Follow the conversation using the hashtag SpecializedRx. A pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Senator Bill Cassidy. He's long been a leader in healthcare, is a physician, and served in the House, on the House Energy Commerce Committee, is now serving on the HELP Committee. Please welcome Senator Cassidy. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, man.
Busy time in healthcare.
Yes.
And you know, in this Congress, we had a big piece of healthcare package pass in the SGR fix. And there's another big bill that's pending, and that's the 21st Century Cures Act that overwhelmingly passed the House. A lot of supporters of that legislation. Now it's the Senate's turn. Can you tell us where we are with that legislation in the upper chamber?
Yeah, some of the same issues will be addressed in the Senate bill as in the House. Mm-hmm. Clearly the House bill is going to, in some way give guidance, but there are working groups right now in each of those aspects to try and bring them together at the end for a whole package.
Is there a sense that the presidential politics has already started? Is there a rush to get this done this year before we enter 2016? Or do you think it's such a bipartisan bill that came out of the House that it could move at any point in this Congress? Never underestimate the ability of politics, don't mean to make a pun here, to trump good policy. Yeah, you intended that.
That said,
right.
It is bipartisan.
Mm-hmm.
And we also understand that in a sense, the future will judge our present, if you will, to the degree that we've been able to capitalize upon this kind of dawn of genomics. Mm-hmm. To create lower cost and better health. So I'd like to think that it is bipartisan and that we will overcome politics.
Do you get the sense that there's been some speculation that the Senate bill would be narrower in scope?
I don't know that.
You don't know that. So, but the Senate is going to introduce its own version
Correct.
Of the bill. Okay. Another topic that has gotten hot, certainly over the last few weeks, is that Republican Party has been promising repeal Obamacare and replace it. And now we're seeing a strategy coming out of the House. The House Ways and Means Committee moving not a complete repeal, but repealing certain mandates, like the individual mandate, the employer mandate, and under reconciliation, it also would defund Planned Parenthood. Do you see this as being something that the party will rally around, that this legislation, which certainly would have the votes in the House, could attract enough support? Remember, it only needs 51 in the Senate under reconciliation, that this could be something that the party rallies around?
I think so, but keep in mind the House has been trying to take care of, if you will, rid society of the most onerous provisions, either whole or in part, since the bill was passed. Mm-hmm. So that strategy is not new. Obviously, if King v. Burwell had gone against the administration, that would have effectively judicially repealed a portion of the law, mm-hmm. and then would have, and my office and others, had bills that would have replaced that portion. The strategy that I think is wise right now, because right now, let's just face it, not being partisan, but just pointing out that under the president's health care law, costs are exploding. And the out-of-pocket exposure to someone on a group health plan has risen dramatically, far more than their wages. Somebody who's on the exchanges, if they're not getting a subsidy, they're getting hosed. With the Oregon state just now giving a 25% increase in exchange rates, Louisiana 19%, and this is before the Cadillac tax hits. Mm-hmm. So I do think that there is a desperate need to repeal and replace portions that are effectively cost drivers because hospitals are doing well, pharmaceuticals and insurance companies, but the premium payer is doing poorly.
Mm-hmm. Hillary Clinton recently talked about the price of prescription drugs and how they're increasing. Do you think that healthcare and the price of drugs and getting costs under control are going to be a big issue in 2016?
It is going to be a big issue, and it's easy to look at and to misunderstand. Let's take Sovaldi. By the way, USC is sponsoring this. I did my residency and fellowship at USC, and I just met their alumni outreach person, and she's sending me an application to donate money to them. It was a meeting I should have foregone. That said, let's just take Sovaldi. As a hepatologist, a liver specialist, if you actually targeted who you gave that pill to, not to the worried well, the 65-year-old woman who's surfing off of Malibu, who infected at age 20 but now at 65 has no damage to her liver. She's worried well and she's going to take a therapy just so that she's well. That's probably a waste of resources. In fact, it is. Just statistically, she is going to die with hepatitis C when she's 100, but not die because of it when she's 70. On the other hand, if you take somebody who is at stage 3 fibrosis, just about to form end-stage liver disease, if you do not treat her, you're going to spend $200,000 a year until you transplant her, and then it's going to be roughly $1 million, maybe $2 million, and then it's going to be $100,000 every year thereafter. So if you are inserting this high-priced medicine at that point, it is an incredible value proposition. So I think we need to have a more sophisticated viewpoint beyond just kind of, oh my gosh, rates are going up, we're not going to blame the system that has been put in place, we're going to find some other culprit, which I think is what Ms. Clinton seems to be verging on.
Kind of a two-part question. Your background in medicine, was that a big impetus for running for public office?
Well, I can tell you, I could say, well, I was a 48-year-old guy who just wanted to do something different in life, and on some level that would be true. I do think God moves us at times to be a little dissatisfied with where we are. On the other hand, there's a lot of reasons why I ran. My wife, who's also a physician, we looked around and we just said, heck, we don't like the way the country's going. I do think in our society, if you don't like the way the country's going, and you feel as if you have something to offer, our civic duty is to offer ourselves in some way. I have been doing it through academics and caring for the uninsured, but nonetheless felt, if you will, to go in a different direction. My wife's incredibly supportive of that, so that's how we did it.
As far as, big topic we're talking about today is how providers are paid, and that's changed significantly over the years, from the Balanced Budget Act to the Give Back bills to the Affordable Care Act, and then to the SGR. What do you see as the challenges in getting this formula right? That's a broad question, but clearly you have a program that needs some cost controls because it is headed for bankruptcy.
Which program in particular?
Medicare.
Yeah, so if you speak of Medicare in particular, let's just go back to basics. The way that anybody has ever controlled cost is by taking the patient-physician relationship and aligning the incentives of the patient and the physician so that in a fiduciary and in a health-wise way, those interests are mutually in line. And there's a spectrum here. It can be from a health savings account in which the patient has the most responsibility, or it can be to something like a WellMed model, where there's if you read Atul Gawande, if I pronounced his name correctly, in the New Yorker, spoke about how McAllen, Texas, is doing so much better now. It's implied it's because of ACOs. It's actually not because of ACOs. WellMed goes a two-sided risk with insurance companies on Medicare Advantage programs. And they'll take 85% of what the insurance company is getting from CMS. And then the physicians decide how to control cost. Their metrics show that they consistently outperform a Medicare cohort who is not enrolled in such a program. Their readmission rate is half. You can go through all the metrics you look at, and they're better. But in this case, the physician and the patient are aligned in terms of both financial and fiduciary. If you just put in supercomputers and central command and control economy, that's what the Soviet Union did, it failed. My criticism of the Affordable Care Act is that basically is what it is. On the other hand, if you have prospective assignment of a patient to a physician, and they both have this patient-physician relationship, you have what is called an activated patient in the academic literature, both concerned about cost, both concerned about health. Costs go down and health improves. That's a Republican alternative in 30 seconds.
Attacking healthcare fraud and abuse, interview on CNN last night, Donald Trump talked about how so much money is lost in systems, Medicare, Medicaid. What is the best way to go after fraud? I mean, you talk to one person's fraud is another person's just reimbursement.
So again, if you align the patient and the physician, no one is better at understanding what is fraud or what is unnecessary than a physician, because that is our training. So if you go to this model of physicians who are going to two-sided risk with MA plans, and again, the doctors are doing better, seeing fewer patients on their panel, but spending more time with them. Let's say, Bob, that you are 85 years old. And you need your hip replaced. Now,
it's funny, actually, I do need my hip replaced, actually, right now. Yeah.
And you look great for 85. Let me just tell you that, man. It's just incredible.
Yes.
No, but you're younger. So really, you need a hip that is more durable.
Right.
Which is more expensive. So it's reasonable for the orthopedist to give you that more durable, expensive hip. If you're 85, frankly, you're not going to be as active, and you're not going to live as long. So the physician can go to the orthopedist and say, listen, this guy's not Bo Jackson.
Right.
He doesn't, for those of you who are old enough to remember Bo Jackson, not Leonard Fournette for all the LSU fans. And so you can say, listen, you don't have to put in titanium. You can put in something of lower cost.
Got it.
Similarly, the physicians in these groups that do this, they look at the folks who are doing dialysis. This group is high cost, good outcomes, high cost, poor outcomes, low cost, good outcomes. And as a physician, I can tell you ways in which that could be. They'll look at their data. Hey, wait a second. Hey, everybody, this group is low cost, better outcomes. We need you all to align, or else we're only going to refer to this group. Now, physicians can do that, and that which is one person's necessary treatment, if the outcome is no different, it exposes it as unnecessary. And that's where I think that patient-physician relationship, coming together in a mutually beneficial fiduciary and health relationship, has the ability to squeeze that excess cost out, be it fraud or just duplicative services.
As far as what you're hearing from, we talked a little bit about this before in our prior event, but I think it's always telling to hear what patients are saying, what beneficiaries are saying at the local level about Washington and how your unique perspective of medicine and lawmaking, what do you take from all that?
Well, my practice has been working in a public hospital system for the last, since 1990, and if you include my time at County USC, since 1983. And so my patients are typically uninsured. And it's interesting, some have been able to get on the exchanges, then they hit a $6,000 deductible. And for someone who's uninsured, to have a $6,000 deductible, well, why don't you make it $600,000? Why don't you make it $6 million? The idea that $6,000 to them is unsurmountable. Now there's ways to address that, but for folks who are used to going to the emergency room and getting care for free, to now have a $6,000 deductible, in their kind of scheme of things, my gosh, my time is not worth that much. It is cheaper for me, if you will, time-money equation to just go to the emergency room.
So those numbers, because of course the proponents of the Affordable Care Act say, look at all the reduction in uninsured, but it's not practical.
So the large majority of the reduction in the uninsured has come from an expansion of Medicaid. Okay. Now Medicaid pays physicians below their cost. Now, as my wife says, if you're getting paid below your cost, you cannot make it up in volume. And it was ironic that the week the Affordable Care Act passed, the New York Times ran an article, Robert Pear was the author, as I recall, of an oncologist in Michigan whose practice had so many Medicaid patients, she was going bankrupt. And she had to discharge patients from her practice because otherwise she was going to go belly up. One of the women they interviewed had, I think, ovarian cancer. We tried to track her down. She died like a month later. Now think about this. You're paying a physician lower than cost, and yet you're calling that insurance. To paraphrase St. Paul, it is the illusion of coverage without the power of access. What I'm concerned about, Jonathan Gruber, back when he was a nonpartisan, wrote an article, academic article for MBER, which said that 65% of those who sign up for Medicaid in a Medicaid expansion formerly had private insurance, but they dropped their private insurance to get onto Medicaid. Now think about it. You got a $6,000 deductible. You cannot afford your specialty drugs. And someone says you can get on Medicaid, And if you get on Medicaid, you don't have a deductible and you get your specialty drugs for free. What do? You divorce your spouse and you sign up for Medicaid because now your income is not joined. There's some evidence that that is occurring, not to blame anybody, just to say this is a rational economic decision. Or in some way you forego income in order to qualify for Medicaid where formerly you did not, or maybe now with the expansion you do qualify, so instead of your employer paying for a portion of it, you just get it for yourself. We've just taken that bill and we've given it to the taxpayer. When I read about Kentucky having both Medicaid expansion, but now record visits to the emergency rooms, it suggests to me that people who formerly had access because they had private insurance which paid their physician well enough, now don't have access to their physician, but used to receiving care and now on Medicaid, they are now going to the emergency room. I don't know that, but that is something that we should explore. It is what Jonathan Gruber predicted would happen, if you will.
Well, last question, as far as innovation in healthcare, how can Washington keep up? Can Washington keep up, whether that's...
What do you mean by that?
I mean, the healthcare technology is exploding, just like energy technology is exploding. As far as legislation and regulations, what is the key? Is it deregulatory efforts? What is a way that Washington can help as opposed to hurt?
No, so there's several components of what Washington can do and not do. One is we need to increase funding for biomedical research. As an academic physician who never got an NIH grant, in full disclosure, but admire those who did, we need to do that. But I think we also need to have some higher standards for NIH. If you look at the amount of patents produced by NIH relative to, say, DARPA, DARPA is putting out that many patents, with a much smaller budget, by the way, and NIH is putting out far fewer relative to the dollars they're receiving. So there's some reform there. FDA can more quickly process applications. I think that they would admit that they could do things a little bit more quickly. For example, we just had a hearing on biosimilars, and there's rules that have been pending forever, so it seems. Can we have a little bit more expeditious release of those rules? I think that we have to be sensitive to how we treat the pricing of drugs. Indeed, some drugs it's abusive how they are priced, but they're priced. They exist. They're out there. And if you're someone it's interesting, I'm again, gastroenterologist, excuse me, people with Crohn's disease used to have terrible lives with multiple surgeries, having portions of their bowels removed until finally they had to be fed intravenously because they had no bowel left. Now surgery for Crohn's disease is like, oh, do we still do that? It hardly, routine. Because one of these specialty drugs, now several of them, so effectively cures it. Man, we don't want to kill that golden goose.
Senator Cassidy, thank you very much. Please thank Senator Cassidy for joining us.
Thank you, Bob.
I'd also like to welcome to the stage Dana Goldman, who's the chair and director of the Leonard Schaefer Center. Please welcome Dana Goldman.
Thank you very much. Am I on one of these mics? Can you hear me in the back? Yes, great. Welcome. That was a great introduction, and I want to say, as one of the co-sponsors of this event, the Schaefers, as the co-sponsors, we decided that only I get to present slides. And so I'll be giving you a brief introduction to kind of set the stage for what we're going to hear later. And so what I'd like to talk about today is rethinking specialty drugs. And I think it's very important to understand, we hear a lot that this issue is coming down to price. And so what let me acknowledge, by the way, our sponsors. As the senator said, NIH funding is vitally important, and we think it's vitally important in a lot of ways to think about value as well. And this research was sponsored by NIH as well as by Amgen. It does not represent anyone's views, so except my own. And we know that the pricing of these treatments is often controversial. We've seen a lot of stories in the media, and it gets a lot of attention: HIV, cancer, and as we'll discuss, cardiovascular disease. But fundamentally, it reflects a trade-off that we see, and it's a trade-off between the short run and the long run. And if you think in the short run, society really wants unfettered access to these treatments. That is to say, if we have a really exceptional treatment, it would be nice if we gave it away. You should, as economists, we would think that we lower the price to basically the cost of production, which in many cases for oral agents can be quite low. And we should have, that would encourage access. But the problem with that is we know that if we dropped all the prices today, in the long run, we wouldn't have any innovation. And the reason we have things like patent policy and market exclusivity and the like is because we know we have to reward innovators for risk. And so the net effect of this can be thought of as a trade-off between the short run, which I would call patient rights, and the long run, which are patent rights. And I want to, people think that this is a new debate because healthcare costs are so high, but actually this dilemma played out quite dramatically in the mid-1990s. And as people know, HIV is one of the most devastating diseases globally. And in the mid-1990s, we developed highly active antiretroviral therapy. And I live in Los Angeles, and I remember in the early 1990s when Magic Johnson, who played for the Los Angeles Lakers, he announced his retirement from basketball. And a lot of us thought that was the last we would see of Magic Johnson. But then now, today, I just heard that Magic Johnson owns the Dodgers. So there's a certain, he's one of the most successful businessmen, and we see the effects of the introduction of HAART, as it's called. But there were a lot of protests over the high price of HAART. You can see there, patent enforcement equals death. And fundamentally, what's going on here is we're not thinking about price in the right way. So let me just put up one curve here, which is how HAART affected survival. So this shows the probability that people are alive the years after infection, and without going into too much detail, the goal of healthcare is to move this curve out. That is, at any age, we would like people to live longer. And so this is what it looked like in 1984, 1994, and then in 2000. And you can see that dramatic expansion, and that really was reflected in an increase in life expectancy of about 15 years. Now, economists are very good at math, not good at much else, actually, it turns out. Certainly not good at medicine. But if you take those 15 years and you multiply it by all the people who've been infected with HIV, and then you multiply it by the value of a life year, and that's something we're required to do when we think about cost, which is about $150,000, you get a very big number. And but the problem here was that, and the reason why the policy discussion was so disappointing is that if you look at the data, about $63 billion in revenues went to the manufacturers of HIV drugs. Okay, and a lot of people look at that and they say that's a really, really large number. But if you do that multiplication that I said before, then you've got about $1.4 trillion in benefits to society through this increase in health. And so another way to think about this, and I think Senator Cassidy is right about thinking about biomedical innovation and the right, encouraging patents, because this was an NIH-sponsored activity to begin with, and in the end, 5% of the value created to society was returned to the innovators. So the fundamental problem here is when we focus on price, we're missing the point. So if you just think about being a consumer generally, when you go to the store and you look at the price of an iPhone, you say, do I want to spend the $700 to get this phone? And you know whether you want to do it. In healthcare, when we look at the prices, they're the prices of the inputs. So it's the price of $20 to go to the doctor or whatever. But you're not there at the doctor's office to actually read the magazines unless you're some sort of archivist from 10 years ago. You're there at the doctor because you want to get better. And so what you care about is the price of health. And in the case of HIV, thinking about Magic Johnson, if he had been diagnosed a few years earlier, despite his enormous wealth, there was nothing he could pay to improve his health, essentially. In other words, the price of health was infinite. After the introduction of HAART, the price became about $15,000 per life year, or about $15,000 a year. And so as an economist, when the price goes from infinity to $15,000, we say that's a really good sale. We should buy more of these drugs. But the public policy debate was, oh, we weren't paying for these drugs. Now they're $15,000 a year. They put enormous pressure on our budgets. And so the idea is to restrict access. And I think that in that sense, we possibly are making the wrong decisions. And, you know, this isn't just a story of HIV. We see this a lot in cancer. People often say, and we'll be discussing this in the afternoon, treatment is often viewed as very low value. We say it's expensive. There's some questions about whether it decreases quality of life. But it turns out, and I won't go into this, that if you start looking at some of the more innovative cancer drugs, they've also generated quite a bit of value. And in addition, even the second-line therapies, so we often criticize second-line therapy as being a Me Too innovation, but even those can generate a lot of value. So the lessons here from HIV and cancer are that for breakthrough products, innovators often only capture a minority fraction of the value that's created. And if we use launch prices, that is the price that's announced by the manufacturer, we're missing a lot of the long-term dynamics. So you think about HIV, we can now treat HIV in Africa for about $1 a day. Okay? And so generic entry eventually will lower the price. Having multiple competitors will lower the price. And we know that there are price discounts. I'm sure that's coming, going to be discussed at some point today. So a similar story is now playing out in cardiovascular disease. You know, if we look at the American College of Cardiology and the American Heart Association, they have guidelines for who should be taking statins. And we've developed this new PCSK9 inhibitors, which have been indicated to address two of these risk groups, those with atherosclerotic disease and those with very elevated cholesterol, often people with familial hypercholesterolemia. So genetic disorder that means their cholesterol, their bad cholesterol levels are quite high. And if you look, it turns out people think that we've been very successful with statins, and we have. They've been remarkable drugs that have changed the progression of heart disease in the United States. But there is still, and you look in these two risk groups, there are probably about 12 million people who are taking statins but have not attained the goals that we've set for them. And so we kind of modeled out some of the effects that if we could lower these cholesterol in these people, what would it mean? And it turns out if you look over, I can't even see my own slides, but I think if you look over 20 years, we're talking about the potential to avert 1.3 million cardiovascular deaths and maybe about 15 or 16 million heart attacks and similar events. Okay? Now, that assumes that we have immediate universal use, but we know that doesn't happen. If you look at the history of statins, their use in the first 20 years averaged only about 16%. And so when you model a more realistic scenario where you increase use gradually, what you basically get is that if we could diffuse these drugs in the population, so to speak, you could be talking about generating maybe 400 to 800 billion in social surplus. So remember, I had that chart that said HIV drugs, which are probably some of the most successful drugs ever introduced, were going to be worth about 1.4 trillion. Here we're talking about something on the order of 1/3 to 2/3 that magnitude. And so the question is going to become, but again, coming back to price, it's, these drugs are certainly cost effective for these risk groups. But the question is, there'll be so many people treating that we start to focus on price, just like we did in HIV. And so I think the real challenge for us is there a way to solve this? We've had novelty in drug development. Maybe we need some novelty in pricing. We know that payers do not get all the benefits. So if you're a health plan that lowers cholesterol, often the benefits accrue to Medicare. And so it raises a question about whether Medicare and others should be, of course that's always true for many treatments, but we ask our insurers to pay for them. But could we tie payments to outcomes? So in the short term, could we tie it to cholesterol improvement? And in the long term, could we tie it to reductions in these rates of events? It may even mean that we want to price based on risk group. And in particular, pricing on risk group, the history of technology in the United States is not that this is a good or bad technology. We talked about hip replacement earlier. For some people, these technologies are very valuable. The question always becomes, as we start to move it to other populations, is it worth the price? And so if we start to tie reimbursement to the value in those populations, we might be able to, rather than trying to limit access to technology, saying, okay, we'll give you access, and in return, we'll take on some risk-based payment. And I thought it was interesting that the senator was talking about doctors taking on risk-based payment, and maybe we can do that among manufacturers as well. So in conclusion, statins have generated a lot of value to society, but there's still a substantial residual risk. We know that PCSK9 could generate a lot of value over the next 20 years, and they are cost effective for the indications, but there are going to be access challenges. And I would like to start the discussion by thinking about whether innovative pricing might be an opportunity to get around those. So with that in mind, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Josh Hoffman, and if they could come up now. Josh Hoffman is the Senior Vice President from Global Value and Access at Amgen. Steve Pearson is the founder and president of the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review. And Catherine Willimon is the founder and president of the FH Foundation. They're probably the three most knowledgeable people in this area. So let me see if I can. Am I still mic'd? Yes, okay. Wow, that's impressive technology. So Steve, I'd like to start with you and think, is there anything, you've done a lot of work in this area, what are your view on whether there would be some opportunity for value-based pricing that could get us out of this access innovation dilemma?
Well, thank you. Unfortunately, I think as you pointed out quite well, there's probably no way out of the dilemma. It's constantly going to be a question of balance. And I think reasonable people can disagree about whether the current balance is right or wrong, but we're obviously having to grapple with it. You're obviously also right that price is not by itself so much the issue, it is value. And so our research institute took on the PCSK9 inhibitors and tried to do exactly what you suggested. Look at the long-term benefits that it brings to patients. And we all have to be a little bit cautious because to this point today, we know that these drugs lower cholesterol. There have not been conclusive studies yet that they actually prevent heart attacks or strokes. So we are hopeful. It is definitely promising, but our review of the clinical evidence suggested it is promising but still inconclusive about whether it will actually bring a net benefit to patients. There are certainly patient groups that are at highest risk. And for them, I think the balance is going to lead to many people wanting to use these drugs. So we looked at the long-term benefits and the long-term costs and actually found that they were not cost-effective. That the cost to extend life and to improve the quality of that life is at a quite high level. So that brings up one question about whether the current price is a little bit out of alignment with patient value. And up till now in our system, the prices have basically been a black box. Now, it's not like we understand exactly why Apple charges what it does when we walk into the store, but because insurers often are legally required to cover drugs, our federal systems do, I think there's a sense that we need a little bit more transparency and understanding. So to try to ground the prices in how much better patients actually will get with these drugs is one key issue. The affordability, though, is another tough nut, because for drugs like these that could be used for millions of Americans, our analyses suggest that, as you did, you looked at about a 20% use among the eligible population. We assumed it might be 25% over 5 years as patients slowly get started on these. Even if it's only a quarter of the eligible patients, it would lead to a 5-year total spend of over $100 billion. Now, it's not that, again, by itself might necessarily be a poor value, but that money's going to have to come from somewhere. Is it going to come from increased taxes? Is it going to come from less education spending or other sources? So we can talk about value, but ultimately there are also real-world considerations about trade-offs. So I think the idea of a value-based price benchmark and what we do with it is going to be absolutely critical. One last thing is, I also think that this doesn't mean that we're going to set prices. What it means, though, is that we might need to take that balance and create some new incentives to try to get more of a value-based price. So, for instance, if a company were to price a drug in an area where it could meet a value-based price benchmark, maybe that means that it automatically gets low copay, not a lot of prior authorization requirements, so patients can have ready access to this. And we actually kind of really do want to push it out because it's at a price that we feel is really aligned with value. On the other hand, if it's not, then we don't have to set the price, but maybe that increases the requirements for transparency to help justify why the price is as high as it is. Or maybe there are other policy levers in addition to just trying to figure out how to narrow the patient criteria who can take it, make it difficult for doctors to try to get approval for it. But there are other policy levers that we have in place to try to support innovation, like it's forbidden to re-import drugs from countries where it is cheaper. But it's always possible for policymakers to think that we're out of balance, and maybe if a drug isn't priced in alignment with patient value, then maybe we have to forego some of those benefits that we usually give to drug companies and allow patients and others to re-import drugs. So there are other things that we can do, I think, with this basic concept that there is a balance between innovation and the incentives we need for that and affordability, and how do we make that balance work best so that we do get the drugs for the patients who need it in a way that we can really view as sustainable.
Well, I have about 7 follow-on questions, but I'm mindful that I've already taken up a lot of time. So let me just ask Josh, what is Amgen doing about this issue of healthcare spending and value that Steve has raised?
Yeah, so Amgen's doing quite a lot, but maybe I can start with just a comment on the topic more generally. We are quite sensitive to the issues around healthcare spending in this country. But we are concerned that everybody's looking at this problem through a very narrow silo, through their own very narrow silo. Biopharmaceuticals, as Dana mentioned, need to be viewed as an investment in the long-term health of the population, and too often they're viewed as just a short-term cost. And so we end up talking a lot about the prices of the interventions used to treat disease, but the common enemy in the room here is the cost of diseases, the most common diseases that are afflicting Americans. So let's just look at cardiovascular disease for a moment. It's the #1 killer in the United States. Someone is dying every 40 seconds. Over 800,000 Americans are losing their lives every year, and we're spending over $650 billion a year treating unmanaged cardiovascular disease today. So any assessment of the cost of therapies to reduce this risk needs to be seen in that context. Cancer is the second leading cause. We're losing 500,000 Americans a year to cancer, and we're working tirelessly to bring new innovative biopharmaceuticals there. If you look into the future, Alzheimer's disease is going to cost over $1 trillion by 2050. So this is the challenge that we face. Those costs are going to make healthcare unsustainable in the United States, not the prices of Sovaldi or the price of PCSK9 inhibitors. And as a physician, those numbers are just unacceptable. And as someone who works at an innovative biopharmaceutical company, we wake up every day thinking that that is unacceptable and we must do something about it. To comment on what we're doing, we need to put specialty biopharmaceuticals, the topic of this conference, in a little bit of perspective. Specialty pharmaceuticals treat the 3 to 4% of the most vulnerable and sickest patients that we have in America. And they represent about 3 to 4% of overall healthcare spending. That's what we spend on dental services, and is much less than what we spend what commercial insurers spend on their administration of their insurance benefits. So, CMS actuaries have said that overall healthcare spending is going to grow modestly in the next decade, about 6.3%. So there's a lot of concern from payers that specialty pharmaceuticals are consuming too much. They're growing too fast. But as long as overall pharmaceutical spending is modest, which it's being projected to be, specialty pharmaceutical growth is a good thing. It's the specialty biologics that are leading the revolution in genomic medicine. It's leading the movement in precision and personalized medicine that's such an important health system priority. So to the question of value, and we very much appreciate a good, balanced dialogue about value, and ICER has furthered this conversation. But any discussion of value needs to keep patients in the center of that conversation. And it needs to be mutually transparent, using rigorous and evidence-based estimates of population risk, population size, and use realistic estimates of how drugs are going to diffuse into patient care. As it relates to the ICER methodology, there is a care value component that looks at the cost effectiveness of the PCSK9s. We feel that there's been a systematic underestimate of the population risk and overestimate of the population size and its uptake, leading to the conclusions that have been reached. The second part of the ICER methodology is a budget impact methodology that uses a sustainable growth rate or an IPAB-like metric to constrain pharmaceutical spending and pharmaceutical growth to an arbitrary rate. And we don't believe that that is an appropriate economic analysis. It only focuses on the short-term financial metrics of insurers and doesn't consider at all the outcomes that are important to patients. And so we feel that that's a real challenge and deserves some further thinking. Finally, what's Amgen doing? To answer your question directly, we feel like we're doing quite a lot. We wake up every morning and we try to innovate and bring new molecules to the market that can address the most grievous diseases. We're bringing biosimilars to the market because we recognize that we need greater access to biologic medicines at lower cost. And so Amgen hopes to be one of the largest providers of high-quality, reliably supplied biosimilars in the United States soon, and biosimilars are now here. We continue to work tirelessly to reduce the costs of biologic manufacturing, because as you know, that's a very complex process. These are manufactured in living cellular systems. And we're partnering extensively with patients to understand how devices and technology can better engage patients so they're more adherent to their medicines and have a better experience taking their medicines. And we're partnering with payers and providers around the United States on innovative ideas about how to implement value-based contracts and programs to improve population health. Because we believe that when value can be demonstrated, we need to be making those investments. So I hope that addresses some of the thoughts.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think to the extent that there are differences in the views on long-term outcomes from treatment, I would argue that perhaps this creates an opportunity for risk-based contracting, because if you believe in your modeling there's not a lot of evidence of long-term benefit, and Amgen is obviously very committed to this class of drugs. Maybe there's an opportunity to contract around that. But before I get there, Josh, you mentioned the patient. And Catherine has been a tireless advocate for the patient. And I'd like to ask you, how does the debate over prices from public and private payers over PCSK9 inhibitors affect patient care?
Well, you know, honestly, I read the report that you put out, Steve, and this conversation does have an impact. We have a lot of responsibility to get it right, and there were some assumptions made that are not agreed upon by FH experts. And I just want to underline, when we're talking about healthcare, all of this conversation, it really does tremendously impact what access individuals have to that care. What we're seeing from payers is that they are taking some of this erroneous data about the parameters, the diagnostic parameters of FH, and applying them to this population who is really in desperate need of novel therapies. FH is a genetic condition that leads to elevated cholesterol at birth. So we're talking about a population that is affected by heart disease very young, in their 20s, in their 30s, in their 40s, and in their 50s. And the analysis, for example, that you did really looked at the benefit from ages 34, correct me if I'm wrong, to 74, but the lifetime. But for individuals with FH, they're impacted even earlier, and that may not show the full benefit. I think what Senator Cassidy said was an excellent point, which is, if we're going to talk about value, we really need to look at the medical need of each patient. And the best value we're going to get is not determined by price alone, but by how applicable it is to that patient and how much life they still have ahead of them in terms of productive years potentially, and how much need there is for that particular therapy. So I think this, you know, unfortunately, I'm sure you saw it as well. Yesterday, the vice president of Express Scripts was talking about how this wouldn't impact budget, these new PCSK9 inhibitors, as much as had been feared, because they were successfully turning down about 75% of the requests. And this is in part due to some extremely restrictive prior authorization parameters that, again, are not based on the medical expert's sense of, you know, I'm specifically talking about familial hypercholesterolemia, but familial hypercholesterolemia was the first indication for these new therapies, because even though there isn't outcomes data on PCSK9 specifically, there's a lot of data that in this high-risk population, who we know from birth has elevated cholesterol, so it's not just the level, but the lifetime exposure that puts them at risk, that you can significantly add, by lowering their LDL, decades to their life. And unlike the oncology drug argument that maybe these very expensive therapies do not significantly increase survival and perhaps do not increase quality of life, you can't, what data shows consistently is that with specific populations like FH, lowering LDL does increase life, not by days or weeks or months or years, but by decades. And these are people's most productive decades. So I think any time that we're talking about pricing and value in healthcare, we cannot talk about it in the abstract. We have to look at the medical condition that we're talking about as a whole. And as you said, Josh, the cost, for example, of heart disease, which is immense in terms of lives and dollars spent, and the opportunity to circumvent those costs. And what you have with certain groups, those who already have established atherosclerosis and heart disease, they need this therapy as well. But the opportunity to save not only lives and money is seen in this new genomic era, as Senator Cassidy expressed, in being able to say, understanding genetics enough to say, who needs these therapies? Who can we keep from getting ill? And how much money will that save us going forward? And I think to look at it and say that it's not a value-based, that there's not enough value there. Look at my 7-year-old daughter who has FH and tell that to her, because I'm hoping she'll never ever have to have a heart attack at 39 like I did.
Can I respond?
Yes, I was going to say, you could take the rest of the session.
Promise now. Be careful.
Take that back.
Thank you, and of course, I also hope that your daughter does well and benefits from new innovations.
Thank you.
And as a clinician, I myself, I've cared for patients whose tubes of blood, when they're drawn in the blood lab, they come out looking like milk. I mean, they're that full of cholesterol and lipids. We really do have patients who have a serious unmet need. So I still think it's important to note that we are hopeful. There have been other drugs that lower LDL cholesterol that did not actually improve outcomes, even for patients with FH. So we are very hopeful that PCSK9s will, but we still have to wait a little bit. Now, I can't really answer for the insurance companies that have set up initial criteria. The usual pattern very shortly after FDA approval, though, is for them to create some guidelines mostly aligned with the FDA label, because they need some time to try to look at the evidence to think about it. And one thing I would say is that some of this debate, I think, clarifies the need for more independent analysis of the evidence on effectiveness and value, because there are very strong interests and very strong passions on both sides of this debate. And I think it's going to be really helpful if we continue to try to look in a clear-eyed and transparent way as we can at the evidence and debate them. So we've been very happy the fact that our process involves public comment. So we've received from your organization, we received comments from Amgen and many others, and we have made changes to our report. We have responded to those, and you'll see a final draft that will come out. The bottom line, though, is that there is still going to be questions, I think, about, and clinical experts will also, you could get one panel and a different panel, and they'll have at it about cholesterol, and for whom, these drugs are right now best indicated. So there was a survey of practicing doctors in the United States. More than 25% of practicing cardiologists said that they wanted to use these drugs for patients who had very low risks but high cholesterol. So way outside what the FDA was saying, they wanted to use it for those patients too. So I think we all understand that there have to be some rules around the appropriate use that will create conflict, but hopefully with an independent look at the evidence on both effectiveness and value. And my hat's off to Josh and his company and others. They are doing the studies that will produce better evidence on the real outcomes for patients in a couple of years. So we have a couple of years to wait for that. There will be patients who will use this in the short term, but we get back into that question of a balance. And the balance doesn't mean there won't be conflict, but we have to have some kind of balance.
Okay, I'm going to give Josh one opportunity to respond, and then I want to move to some policy solutions.
So I think this conversation raises some very, very interesting points. I think that the point that Catherine's raising is that the highly restrictive nature of how the payers are looking at PCSK9s, even much more strict than the label would suggest, I think does interact very much with what your intention was around the report. So a budget impact report about PCSK9s that focuses only on the budgetary metrics from an insurer to raise alarm bells at the time a drug is launched absolutely interacts with this notion that the payers are going to heavily restrict the drug. And that is happening, and we're seeing it play out. So that's the challenge I have with this idea of ringing alarm bells on estimates and assumptions that are not based in reality. And so we need, if we're going to do that, this has to be very transparent. We have to have a lot of agreement among clinicians and economists about how to do it. And we should do it with the most evidence-based data available, not people's estimates or guesses about how things are going to play out in the real world. We have real data to look at, and you can see very clearly how the economics work out when you use different perspectives. When you take a short-term perspective using financial metrics from an insurance company, well, the economics don't look very good, do they? Because these are long-term investments in health. And yes, to save lives, to improve health, those dollars don't come back to the insurance company. But when you look at it from a societal perspective, looking at all the social value, and you capture all the outcomes that are meaningful to patients, then you get a very different economic picture. So what's important for all of you to remember is that there will be many assessments of the value of PCSK9s, and there will be heterogeneity in what is found. And what we're obligated to do is look at that totality of the evidence and reach some meaningful conclusions.
I have to I know you gave me a little bit more, and you probably want to jump in too. Many of you probably haven't seen the approach that we or other kind of groups will take to look at this evidence. But I do think it's not fair to say that we don't consider the benefits to patients and that this is somehow just an insurer perspective. We bent over backwards to try to find potential benefits to patients downstream. We assumed that these drugs in lowering the LDL are just as effective at preventing heart attacks and strokes and other hospitalizations as statins are when they bring down LDL, and we don't know that yet. That's not been shown. We gave the benefit of the doubt to the drugs, looked at it as far downstream as we could, and did our best job to say, what do we think are the benefits and the incremental costs? These drugs will not save money to the healthcare system. Amgen isn't claiming that they are. So the real question is, the list price is around $14,000. There's nothing magical about that. It could have been $1,400. It could have been $140,000. At some point, we have to ask ourselves the question, what are we talking about here? If we say we need incentives for innovation and we need access, and the drug had come out at $1 million a course of treatment, we all would have said, well, that's ridiculous. So what we were really talking about is the value and some balance. And if these drugs had been priced lower, I believe it's possible that insurers would not have created quite as restrictive criteria.
I'm going to jump in and say that it's interesting because, in the stock market, if I think a stock is a dog and you think it's a great stock, then you buy and I sell.
Right.
So you have a lot of faith, both of you have a lot of faith in these drugs. Steve is saying he doesn't believe there's evidence there. I think the point is that can be contracted. If you look at the history of HIV drugs and Gleevec, if the manufacturers had been willing to contract and the insurers were willing to step up and make these deals, I think, in part, there's some policy limitations by Medicaid that CMS restricts the ability to do this. But you could contract on the success of this to some extent. So I want to move on, but you look anxious and you've only spoken once.
I just want to say one thing. Thank you. I think there's some inadvertent consequences, though, to what you're doing in terms of access. One of the ways that you assess value in pricing is whether or not there are competitors, right? And in the case of a breakthrough drug, I think it's a little unusual that there are two companies that have come out. I was at the FDA hearing for both of them one day after the other. And there are many more who are investigating their alternatives into the PCSK9 inhibitor class. And so if you're concerned with the prices long term and you're making projections, do you not think that economics will actually play a role in bringing these prices down by themselves? And if it will, I'm just saying, you just have to own what you're doing when you send out a draft release without the input of the FH community. And our organization represents physicians all over the world as well as patients. So we are a research advocacy organization. You have to have the input of that community to really make that value-based assessment. And also, I do think these prices will go down, but if there are inadvertent consequences that are denying patients who need the care access or encouraging such restrictive parameters, I think it's worth acknowledging that it has an impact. Thank you. for letting me say that, Dana.
Yeah, I feel obligated to give Steve yet another last word, but I'm going to move us on.
How about if I respond to your idea?
Okay.
So
yes.
the idea of risk-based or kind of performance outcomes-based agreements has been talked about for several years. It actually caught fire a little bit more internationally than it did in the U.S. I think it's a little bit easier to imagine if a country has a single insurer and a single healthcare system, that they might be willing to look out 10 or 20 years or even 5 years and come up with an agreement. It has worked for some conditions where there's a relatively short-term outcome that you can decide whether it's working or it's not.
Right.
It's actually not a great fit for a drug like this, where the benefits really do play out over the years, so many years, that the people who were around to make the agreement have passed on by the time we all really kind of know. And so the idea, innovation in the way that we think about pricing and paying is going to be absolutely critical for us to grapple with the superior clinical advances that we all want. Full stop. Innovation in pricing, innovation in payment will allow us to do the best job to get and to responsibly pay for the innovations that we all want. What that exactly looks like is what we're all very eager to kind of contribute to going
I
forward.
think we're getting there, and I think these kinds of conversations are pushing us in that direction for sure. I mean, I think that as it relates to LDL and long-term outcomes, I mean, we're expecting outcomes data in a year or two, so we're not too far away. But I will say, I think the perspective is very interesting. There is no surrogate outcome relationship that has better evidence around it than the surrogate relationship between LDL cholesterol and cardiovascular events. In fact, the article in the recent New England Journal of Medicine stated that they don't believe it's a hypothesis anymore. So this relationship between LDL and outcomes, if you talk to the cardiology community, is pretty firmly believed. I think I'm curious as to whether the price had been something very different if people would be questioning, the level of evidence here.
Well, I would say that there was we put out another report that same week, still a draft report, but it was on another pill for heart condition, congestive heart failure. And that price happened to come much closer to a value-based price benchmark for long-term value and for shorter-term affordability. And from my knowledge, the eagerness, I should say, of insurers to really try to make very careful prior authorization criteria for that drug in that condition is nowhere near the concern and the kind of thought that's going into PCSK9s. So,
So a view of the evidence needs to be, a view of,
Well, I
the
think,
evidence.
in all fairness, in healthcare in general, the fact of the matter is sending someone to the ICU almost always means they're going to die. But we're not talking about, there's no evidence of ICU effectiveness, so we're going to get rid of ICUs. So I think there's a lot of evidence on drugs, and actually, Darius Lakdawala, who will be leading the second panel, has done some interesting work in cancer, where he showed that, for instance, markers that, like size of a tumor, are correlated ultimately with overall survival. It doesn't always work. So sometimes we shrink the tumor and the person doesn't have any survival benefit. But cholesterol has to be a very good marker for future outcomes, and one that we can study to see. And my point about ICUs is it's probably been studied way more than some of the other things we're reimbursing in healthcare. That's the last word on that. I have I have three other things I want to talk with all of you about. One is transparency, which you mentioned. The other is reimportation, and then I want to come back to value-based insurance design last. So let's talk a little bit about transparency. I mentioned iPhones earlier. It turns out it costs $200 to manufacture an iPhone. But the iPhone does not cost $215. The iPhone costs $700 because as economists, we're taught that we don't believe in the labor theory of value, which was Karl Marx's view, and that you price things based on the value to society. There's been a lot of policy discussion about transparency and price transparency that I think mixes up cost of production with we just want to know what the prices are, and sometimes in healthcare that's opaque. So I'm going to open this up. I'll start with Josh. What is the view of each of you on price transparency and its importance here?
So, obviously we had a very interesting discussion with a number of policymakers yesterday, and there was a divergence of views about the benefits or the harms of price transparency. We support transparency, of course. I think the question is, how are those information used in our pricing decisions, and how will they be used? So obviously a lot of data we have about what things cost is competitive. And so we feel that we have to be very thoughtful around the transparency requirements. But the more important issue is whether we're using those data to inform our pricing. The basis of how we're thinking about pricing is, when we look at a new molecule, is what is the value that product, across the many indications in which we're studying it, going to bring to patients, to providers, and to society. That forms the basis of how we think about the price of the product, not what our manufacturing costs are, or what our ingredient costs are, or how much our clinical trials cost. That comes in later, and I'll explain how. We also look at what are the competitive benchmarks and the prices that exist in the market. We do a lot of market research with payers, with patients, and with providers about what do they think the value of the product is, and what are they willing to pay for it. And then we arrive at what we think is a value-based price, and then we ask ourselves the question, will that price generate a return sufficient enough to maintain what is, at Amgen, a $4 billion R&D machine that we need to continue to fund to continue to innovate new molecules? Because we know that 95 out of 100 of our programs that we put into clinical studies are going to fail. So that's the magnitude of the investment we need to make. So we think about, at the prices that we can define around value, will that generate the kind of return that can keep that engine going, so that we can continue to treat, our most, or innovate around our most serious diseases. So the transparency is going to be great, but people need to really understand how much of those data are going to be competitive and how much is actually used in our decision-making process.
Steve?
Me. Oh. So I have perhaps a slightly atypical view of transparency. Well, I'm not sure if it's how atypical it is. I just have my story about it. It seems to me that the push for transparency has come out of a certain amount of frustration at not understanding where the prices are coming from. But it seems more in alignment with the way that people think about regulated industries. So if you're a utility company and you want to raise your rates, you have to go to a commission and say, well, we had to spend this much on cutting down the trees and putting down new cables, and we want to raise our prices by X%, and they say yes or no. I'm not sure what the end game is intended to be here, and there's a certain amount of it which is probably just the feeling that if people really understood the internal costs of a drug company, that it would somehow shame you into lowering your price. I'm not sure that that's true. I'm really not. It would be an administrative burden for you to come up with a way to do it. But at the end of the day, we don't price drugs, and I'm not sure we ever intend to, on the basis of the cost of its manufacturing. I think part of this is just to expose that, 9 out of 10 of the 10 top drug companies spend far more on sales and marketing than on research and development. We already know that. I'm not sure what the end game is here with transparency. On the other hand, if we all agree that the value that drugs bring to patients should be the anchor of the price, and not what the market will bear, competitive landscape, or what have you, and the price that the company wants to charge is still higher, then perhaps greater transparency around justifying why would be reasonable. I don't see a blanket approach myself as necessarily targeted enough to really help us. I could be wrong, and I know there are people who feel quite strongly that transparency is a good place to start, but I think we need a little bit more thinking about what we intend to do with the results when we find out that it costs, pennies to make Sovaldi, but it has tremendous clinical benefits. What does that really mean?
I think we can all agree that, as we're thinking about regulated utilities, that if drug manufacturers innovate at the same rate at the cable companies, we're in big trouble. So,
But there's one last coda to that quickly. The frustration I sense is also part of the shifting landscape of healthcare overall. Not that long ago, hospitals, doctors, drug companies, everybody was out, and their business model was to make as much revenue for me as possible, to do as much, to sell as much. More and more and more means I do well. First, hospitals, slowly through DRGs, provider groups, ACOs, have joined in a sense with purchasers and insurers to basically feel like they're on the same page, where they want to create better health at a lower cost. So less with more health is everybody's aligned goal. The only people not inside that tent, it feels to them at times, I think, are drug, device, and other kinds of companies that still make more by doing more, selling more pills, selling more devices. So there's a sense that without that alignment, they're grasping for policy tools that will try to do something with the fact that those two business models now really don't feel like they're working well
But
together.
a service provider business model and an innovator business model are fundamentally different. So we believe that innovating is going to be part of the solution to the problem of improving health, not giving less care, ordering more tests. That's a very different
I give you
concept.
that, no, but if a hospital or an ACO up here, they would jump out of their chairs and say, we're innovating every day. We wake up every day like you do saying, how can we innovate to provide better care?
I think we have to recognize hospitals have not yet realized the way to save money is to keep people out of the hospital. And it's going to be very challenging for them when they figure out that the way the ACOs are going to make money is by emptying out the hospital. And it's going to be a somewhat tortured process to get to those savings. I agree with you that doctors have kind of figured that out, but I don't think on the hospital side we're there yet. But I want to talk about reimportation. So you mentioned that as a possibility here. I want to talk about unintended consequences of policy as well. So coming back to price transparency, for example, when Medicaid said we get the best price, the net effect of that was that some of the employers and insurers who had very favorable pricing relationships actually lost them, and so their prices go up. So sometimes transparency doesn't work so well. Similarly, on the reimportation side, if we allow reimportation from Canada, I had one person joke with me that the result of this would be that no one will sell drugs in Canada. So the net effect is the Canadians won't get their products. So I want to talk about, is reimportation really a solution here, or is it just a feel-good policy that kind of makes us feel like we're solving the problem?
Well, let me start since I brought it up.
Yeah.
And I probably shouldn't have in the context of such a serious meeting, because my point was that there are a series of policy in place today that have been put in place to try to maintain the incentives for innovation. And I was just suggesting that if a value-based price benchmark isn't achieved, instead of setting a price, policymakers could look at either diminishing or eliminating some of those beneficial policies like
So in other words,
reimportation.
it's a way to generate some leverage.
Well, the thing is, I think that your question is well taken, because it probably would take a lot more thinking about whether that would be a net positive for the country. But there are a series of policies that have been established with the clear intent to try to support innovation. And if what America needs most is not innovative companies, it needs innovative products. And if we're not getting that at a price that the country feels like provides good long-term value and or is affordable, then it has to look at the full basket of policies that it has and see if it can, again, just tilt the balance a little bit in the other direction.
So I think, one of the things about importation that's interesting to me is, I get the opportunity to work with healthcare systems around the world, is it's often generated from the idea that, other countries are paying so much less, we need to go buy, the drugs there, and why is that happening? And I think what folks fail to see often is that, the prices of healthcare services generally in European and other countries, many are much lower than in the U.S. The amount of spending on healthcare in many ex-U.S. countries is much lower than in the U.S. So holding up drug prices and saying, why are drug prices higher in the US than in other countries, in isolation doesn't make any sense. All prices of hospital care, ICU care, our healthcare spending, device prices, they're all dramatically higher in the US than they are in many non-US countries. And let's not forget, many of these countries that we look to have significant price controls with central government single-payer systems. And if you just look between the UK, for example, and the US, the survival rates for cancer are 40% higher among men in the United States and 13% higher among women in the United States, in large part because in the UK they've heavily restricted access to the innovative oncology therapies. And in Australia, another centralized government with price controls, there's an 11-month difference in life expectancy among patients who were given access to the novel innovative biologic medicines and those who were not. So this matters, and I think it really informs the debate about reimportation.
Okay, I want to move to our last topic, which is value-based insurance design. And Catherine spoke quite passionately about limits in access going on at the PBM. I can't remember which one she said, and she accused you of working for them, which I know is not true at all.
Inadvertently
Laid it right at your feet.
She was much nicer.
She was right. Yeah, no, I meant she laid it at your feet. But I know you've done some work on value-based insurance design, and thinking beyond PCSK9I now, we're going to have...
It's hard to do.
Yeah, it is hard to do. But there's going to be a class of medications for which, you mentioned heart failure, for example, where there'll be a lot of evidence for one group of patients that these are valuable, and we can negotiate, we can talk about price. But the bottom line is that it's good for patients, and they probably should get them. But then there'll be an effort to restrict access. The insurer response is to keep it at 3%, let's say. But if these are classes of medications, they can actually help the other 97%. Is there an opportunity through value-based insurance design to get out of this dilemma that it's either yes or no? And I'll start with Steve on that, and then we'll take it to Josh.
So the right answer here is not yes or no. It is. It is yes and. There absolutely is, and a lot of payers have been pushing this idea. A lot of employers and others are very interested in the idea that there certainly, and in some cases, there are entire conditions like diabetes for which we know that treatment to keep the blood sugar in control is going to do good things for the health of the patient and for the financial outcomes of health. So why are we asking patients to pay anything out of pocket if that creates a barrier to their using their medications? And not just out-of-pocket payments, but what else can we do? Can we send someone to their doorstep and help them take the medicine? I think there are some insurers who will speak later, and they might want to comment back on this because they think a lot about the worst value health care is when you actually spend for the treatment and the patient doesn't get it or doesn't use it or doesn't benefit from it. So they have a real interest in making that loop complete. The barriers to that are mainly logistical. It's just trying to figure out how you would use your existing data systems to quickly enough identify a patient with one level of severity or one different aspect that's using this drug and connect that with a lower copay, whereas somebody else pays a higher copay. And I have talked to some employers who say, even if we figured out all the computer algorithms, I have to tell my employees why Joe pays more out of pocket than Jane. And that's a hard, just even the concept of telling people why they're paying different amounts out of pocket can make it feel unfair to them. So there's a little bit of resistance on that side. Most of it's on the logistical side. The global idea of trying to make our benefit structures more clinically nuanced, spot on.
Josh?
Well, I think I agree with Steve completely. I think one way to solve the problem of the challenge and how big it is to focus it. And again, specialty biopharmaceuticals are a good place to start. Let's think about the problem that we face right now. Again, 3% of our most vulnerable and ill patients are using specialty drugs. It's the specialty drugs where most health plans are putting enormous cost-sharing burdens on the patients. So these patients, in essence, are being punished for their biology. These are people who have not responded to standard therapy. They have grievous diseases and are very ill, and they're paying 30, 40, 50% co-insurance, not just co-payments. So, and this even happens when someone with a terrible diagnosis fails all the drugs that the health plan says they have to take, and then when they fail them, they have to pay a 40 or 50% co-insurance on top of that. Two equivalent patients with breast cancer, for example, one is biomarker positive, one's biomarker negative. They pay the same premium to the same health plan for the same insurance product. One will pay a few $100s out of pocket, one will pay several $1,000s out of pocket because of the different biology. That doesn't make any sense medically or from a policy perspective. So I think we should focus there. That's where we should start. And value-based insurance design, as Dr. Fentrick has pointed out, is a great, very feasible solution to that problem.
Catherine?
Well, I think it just goes back to the idea of targeting those that might get the most leverage, right, from the therapies. And I think that Senator Cassidy did a great job of illustrating that with his hepatitis C example. But that, again, to your point, Steve, that insurance companies should be willing to work hand in hand with clinicians and others to make that nuanced set of decisions. And that it will pay for everyone in the end.
I think that could be our last word, but I'm going to open it up to, would any of you like some last remarks? We're out of time, so great. Well, in that case, thank you all. You've been very gracious with your time, and thank you.
We'll
take a break, and then we'll do the next session.
Thank you.